Hi everybody and welcome to the last lesson of the Germany course. Today we are going to look at the Nazi persecutions of the Jews and other minorities in Germany, 1933 to 1939. Obviously there's a bit of a sensitivity warning for this lesson. Some of the content is really difficult, but we need to understand the experiences of the Jews and the other minorities and the plans for what the Nazis were trying to do. Okay, so let's just get on with this lesson. And there's a lot of thinking about pictures and thinking about what was going on, but also some critical knowledge that would need to be included in an answer that you might have to write on this topic. Okay, so as we said, a bit of a warning, some of the images might be upsetting today, as well as the content of this lesson. So we'll try and look at it from a really sensible, sensitive, mature point of view. And if anything is a little bit too much for you, then just move the video forward. So we'll start by looking at these 4 images, and you can just take a bit of time to reflect on what it is that you see. Some of the images are very much typical of what you might expect to see in the later years of Nazi Germany and perhaps a little bit after. So we can see a shooting range in the top. The man or the boy shooting looks quite young, so we can maybe put some of that into Lincoln or Hitler Youth information and lessons. We can see obviously there's a camp and some of the physical attributes of the prisoners. We understand that. And the top right hand picture looks like a boycotting image or sign being put onto a shop, a Jewish shop perhaps. And if you just zoom into the lady, I don't know what she's thinking. Is she upset by this? Is she supportive of this? She looks like perhaps she was going to a shop and obviously can't go now. All sorts of backstories to some of these images. Obviously they're just here to try and get us to think a little bit. And then obviously we can see the bottom right hand picture is the selection of Auschwitz. I'll probably take a moment at this point to say, remember that Auschwitz is not part of our course. We'll look at persecutions today and we'll do a little bit at the end about the Holocaust and life after 1939 when the war started. But please remember, for our course only goes up to 1939. So we don't need to talk about anything after that. We don't need to talk about the final solution or the Holocaust. But while we're here and we're rounding off the end of the Germany course, I think it is important to still look at that part of the story as well. Okay, so furthermore, a few more pictures. You can see a shop here that has been written all over the windows, Jew. So obviously if you're seen going into that shop or any of those things that we talked about that might get you the death penalty in the new laws, then that's what that's for. We can see people being rounded up in the bottom left-hand picture, taken to the ghettos or maybe from the ghettos towards the camps. And the top picture appears to be some young people assaulting or beating up a man, a Jewish man. It's the glee in their faces that I think are what I want you to draw your attention to on this particular picture. This looks like a quite enjoyable process for them, showing that indoctrination and that violence is very well and truly working. At the bottom is another picture from the Holocaust or during the Holocaust years of the Einsatzgruppen taking people out to Eastern Europe into the sort of countryside and executing people. You can see here that this mother is holding up her daughter or her child and one bullet is going to do the job, going through both mum and baby. Genuinely to save bullets as the war effort was starting to struggle a little bit. So these are all things that are obviously really, really tough to look at and think about, but it shows us the extremity of this story, how this story ended, how it culminates in this utter human tragedy. All right, a few more pictures before we get into the content. We can see again people rounded up, people being hanged, and in the bottom right hand side we can see young people in their uniforms, the pajamas if you like, at the camps. So it affected everybody, this persecution. Okay, so it's important to start with, and we understand the term persecution. This is something serious. This is a word that sort of shows longitude. It happens over time, constantly, consistently. It's not sort of a one-off. Persecution is a key word. So let's get into some context, if you like, of where this is coming from and some of the language that was being used at the time. So in Mein Kampf, when he writes his Mein Kampf, he talks about this master race. We know about the Aryan race. The master race is going to be blonde hair, blue eyes, you know, tall, athletic, things like that. And the word for master race in German is Herrenvolk. All right, so we'll keep that in mind. We'll try and use that language if we can in our answer. to be thinking about what they were trying to create. Untermenschen is subhuman, so anything that they believe to be subhuman or Untermenschen would be up for this persecution. So the Slavs, the Gypsies, the Jews, gay people, etc. And we'll have a look at all of these people that they deem to be subhuman in this video, in these minorities. Then Untermenschen Lebensunwerters means life not worth living, subhumans unworthy of life. So Hitler or the Nazis have decided that there are certain people in society whose life is unworthy of life, who they don't deserve to be alive, for want of a better term. And just saying that sort of upsets me, just the thought that somebody can decide that somebody's life is less valuable and are not worthy of being alive. And of course, they're going to remove them and they're going to kill them so that they can't procreate, so they can't have their own children. That's the gist of what we're doing here. All right, so some racial beliefs of the Nazi Party. We know all this stuff anyway, but Nazi policies would make the German state as strong as possible, the Herrenvolk, the master race. The way to do this was to make Germans, the population, as strong as possible. All right, two strands of this: eugenics and racial hygiene, which we'll look at in a minute. So if you do your notes with a little subtitle of eugenics and racial hygiene, that is the gist of what they're trying to do and how they're going to do it. So eugenics is basically just selective breeding. So you get the best parents and they will obviously produce the best child. You will also remove unsuitable parents from this so as to not dilute the offspring. And if any of you breed cats or dogs or horses or anything, you'll know that the best child or best dog, cat, horse, foal, whatever you want to call it, are from really strong parents. It's basic science, isn't it? We know this from our biology. It's just basic. And this is the theory here, that if you could breed out all of these inadequacies and disabilities and things, and you only have strong people mating, then eventually you get rid of all disabilities. Okay, so that's the idea behind this thing. So this is a subject, as you know, that they're taught at school. So the children are taught about eugenics. This is also taught at the Hitler Youth as well. So there's a constant message of eugenics, of being told about the master race and how we create the master race and how we don't, how we interfere with the master race, how making poor choices in your partner might cause a problem for the master race. And to do that, they would need to sterilize. So anyone, a woman particularly, who produces a child who may be deemed Untermenschen or have disabilities, then that woman will be sterilized so as to not be able to have children again, which is kind of, contradictory to the idea that these women were expected to have loads and loads and loads of kids, except if they produce a child that there's something wrong with it in the eyes of this Nazi state. She will be stopped doing that. So that's the eugenics in a nutshell. It's quite clear, quite obvious what it is, and that's why the children would be encouraged to seek out a mate, a partner who is Aryan as well. Now, racial hygiene is exactly what it sounds like. Hygiene to clean, clean and erase, okay? So policies are adopted in this story, in school and Hitler Youth and propaganda in the main society and main state. Pupils are adopting this policy to make Germany as Aryan as possible. So you're going to clean off anything that isn't Aryan. That's the long-term plan. Remember, Hitler's thinking of doing this over 1,000 years. He called it the 1,000-year Reich. He wouldn't be there for all of that, obviously, but people who would follow on, and these children would grow up to become the new leaders of this super master race. And perhaps when they've taken over the whole world, who knows what the plan was in their head. But the point is, and the main bit of it is, that Aryans should only reproduce with other Aryans. Laws are being passed to prevent mixed race marriages. We'll talk about the Nuremberg laws in a minute, but we also know that the death penalty was issued for anybody having relations with a Jew. Or someone could deem any relationship perhaps that wasn't suitable to be a death penalty. So anti-Semitism is a key word in all of this. We can see examples of anti-Semitism in the photograph on the screen. We know what anti-Semitism is. After the last year or two, anti-Semitism has played a huge part again within society around the world. Anything that's anti-Jewish would be deemed as anti-Semitic. Okay, so the religion, customs and looks make Jews stand out as different is an anti-Semitic sort of trope. Calling out somebody on how they look. Some Christians hated Jews. They blamed them for Jesus' death. It was the Jews that handed Jesus over to Pontius Pilate, the leader in Rome at the time. when Jesus was crucified. So a lot of Christians hate the Jews for that, or these sort of tropes, these stories are perpetuated. Jealousy, perhaps, of Jewish people who may be wealthy in lots of ways. And of course, the rise of the German nationalist is blaming the Jews for the defeat in World War One. The Treaty of Versailles was blamed on the Jews, hyperinflation, the Great Depression. Anything that could possibly be blamed on the Jews was blamed on the Jews. And Hitler too obviously hated the Jews as well. So we can see this really strong anti-Semitic feeling within Germany. There was no surprise. People knew what Hitler was believed. He said in the 1920s he was going to hang the Jews until they rot. So when people voted for Hitler and he got into power and then they start doing policies like this, it can really come as no surprise to anybody that that's where the Nazis were going, and certainly where Hitler was going. Most moderate Germans, so those people who aren't crazy, nasty, I suppose the worst of the Nazis, moderate people, they were influenced by the propaganda, the movies, the newspapers, and of course the fear that if they would in any way show some sort of favour to a Jewish person, they might find themselves in trouble as well. So the whole terror and propaganda thing really accentuated this and exacerbated it. So they ended up turning a blind eye to it and maybe participating in some of the persecutions. We saw, didn't we, with that Ressi Krauss in the Gestapo lesson, where she grassed on her neighbour and stuff, or denounced her neighbour. That's all part of this, how this propaganda had sort of made people feel they needed to denounce people and to tell the state on activities that perhaps were a bit anti-state, anti-Semitic, or whatever it might be. So this first little bit of today is all about setting the scene for the culture, context of Nazi Germany, to some of this really horrible stuff. Okay, so remember in the propaganda, The Eternal Jew, that movie we talked about, where they sort of associate Jewish people with rats and flies and chaos and uncultured, and all those kinds of things. And you can see in this image here the anti-Semitic of it. You know, Jews are only worried about money and they're violent and they're communist and just sort of not what you might expect a normal human being to look like, hunchback and all the rest of it. So this is perpetuated all the time, as well as images like this. You can see the images here in school. The Jew is our greatest enemy, beware of the Jew, while they've got some kids up at the front who are having to say that. Probably the Jews being forced to say it themselves, which would have been horrendous. And we've done this in the education lesson, haven't we? We know that a lot of these Jews were forced and humiliated in their class until they weren't allowed to go to school anymore. And then this cartoon shows a Jewish boy, a German boy. He's been brought up to the front by the teacher, and they're pointing out the characteristics of a Jew. They're saying the Jew has got a big nose and things like that. So even from a young age, children in schools are being sort of primed for this anti-Semitic thought process. And then other children's books have things like this, where he looks obviously like a bit of a wrong un. He's taking the girl. He looks, a bit like a paedophile, I guess, if you want to use words like that. He's trying to distract her, and he's got the characteristics of this Jewish person taking this Aryan girl, taking advantage of her. So these images are all being sort of thrown at children in order to try and sustain and build this anti-Semitic feeling within the country. And that helps definitely. So for the rest of this lesson, and I think the notes that you might want to do, you want to do it in these 4 categories. So we're going to look at minorities as a whole first, and then the Jews. It's important, and I understand why, when we think about Nazi Germany, we think about Jews and the Holocaust, and that is obviously massive and a huge part of the persecutions, but there were persecutions of other minorities as well that we must be aware of. So we'll look at the Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, and the disabled, and then we'll spend some time with the Jews at the end as a separate group persecuted. But they did persecute all of these minorities as well. So the Slavs to begin with, just do your notes in a little mind map if you like, or just, bullet points of a paragraph or a subheading. So the Slavic people are basically those from Eastern Europe. All right, so anyone from Eastern Europe may be classed as a Slavic person. When you think of the old countries like Yugoslavia, Slovakia, Slovenia, they sort of have that word in there, don't they, Slav? So they are taught in school that the Slavic people are Untermenschen, they are subhuman. And then this idea about the Lebensraum, where the Nazis were going to conquer all of the world, give this land to the good, perfect Germans in this master race over the next 1,000 years. So Lebensraum is living space. The Slavic lands are going to be taken and used for Germans to have this extra living space. And the Slavs are persecuted a little bit less than some of the other minorities before the war, but then during the war and after 1939, the Slavic people were rounded up as much as anyone else who was deemed to be unnecessary or not required anymore. Okay, so obviously a lot of the Polish community were murdered during the Holocaust during World War II, sorry. The Polish Jews were the vast majority. So the Slavs, that's kind of sort of done with that bit. They're just an element of a minority that we can talk about in one paragraph about these persecutions. And then we could maybe talk about the Gypsies in a second paragraph or all together. So the Nazis believed, as stereotypically a lot of people sometimes do think, that Gypsies sort of come around, they make a mess, they don't pay taxes, and all those kind of things that people who are a little bit, I don't know, nasty, if you like, or if they have an opinion that perhaps isn't based on fact, they're the kind of things that they might assume about Gypsies. And perhaps, as always in society, there are always elements of truth when it comes to negativity, where someone takes a very small element and makes it huge and spreads the propaganda. That is what happened here. Okay, so things that perhaps may have been a little bit evident were taken and blown up by the propaganda. So they believe that they didn't do enough work or contribute enough taxes. So they're obviously unto-mention. They also pose a threat to the racial purity of Germany. So if a gypsy sleeps with a German girl, that could affect the purity if they produce a child. Okay, so they are banned from having sex with Germans. In 1933, they were arrested as social nuisances and sent to camps. It might be that as they moved around, they were arrested for being a nuisance. I don't know, things like that. So that's very early on into Nazi Germany, 1933. By 1936, so 3 hours in, they're forced to live in cramped camps with no electricity and little water. Just sort of forced to exist, really, but they are being moved away from mainstream society. And then 1938, they're banned from travelling in groups. They're put on a register and they're tested for racial characteristics, which if they failed, they lost any citizenship or any benefits that they had. But of course, they probably, chances are, would have failed those tests. Absolutely sure to be made to fail them so that they could be removed from their citizenship and any benefits that they were getting. Okay, so that's quite a sharp rise in danger from 1933 to 1938. And then 1939, all gypsies were told they should prepare to deport. They should leave. They should go now before they're forced to leave. So in a way, I suppose they were given this chance to get out of Nazi Germany. A lot of the gypsies went to Eastern Europe, and of course, when the war started, the Nazis went to Eastern Europe as well, and so they would have caught them and sent them to camps anyway, particularly sent them to the death camps. So then we have the homosexuals, the next minority that was affected by Nazi Germany. So again, they believe that homosexuals lower the moral standard. They spoil the purity of the German race. Now, I suppose in a way you could sort of laugh at that and think about the chances of a homosexual breeding. You know, it's not as likely as perhaps a heterosexual person, but they believe that this would spoil the purity of the German race. So they are obviously needing to be removed too. In 1935, there were laws against homosexuality, and about 766 males were imprisoned. So they passed these laws. We know about these new laws that come in. It's interesting, isn't it? Because Ernst Röhm was gay and was out early on in this story. Interestingly as well, there's loads of literature out there for gay boys in the Hitler Youth. So it's there. Obviously, homosexuality was a massive part of Germany. But it was after about 1935, 1936, where the Nazis made it another one of their flagship programs to get rid of gay people. By 1938, 12,000 had been imprisoned, so you can see there's definitely an effort to remove them from society. 5,000 altogether died in concentration camps, a lot of them in Auschwitz and other death camps. And then homosexuals, one of the treatments would be to castrate them, possibly chemically castrating them or generally more physically castrating them. So homosexuals also were not let go of this in their minorities. So we've had a look now at the Slavs, the Gypsies and the homosexuals. And then the last of the minorities before we think about the Jews would be the disabled, okay? So the mentally ill or disabled. Now, this is where this really does start hitting home, because all of you watching this video will know somebody, perhaps have somebody in your family who might come under the definition of being mentally ill. So that could be anything from anxiety, depression, whatever, anything of a mental illness. And what you're about to see now possibly would have affected your family. So there'll be some images of some children with Down syndrome and things like that, just to get you in to see very clearly what the Nazis deemed as disabled and mentally ill. And of course, the whole point about trying to create the Herrenvolk, the master race, was that these people would not be able to breed their problems into their future children. So we just start with this image again of a young kid who's in Auschwitz. Almost we could have Googled and found thousands of these young children who were killed in Auschwitz and the other camps simply for being disabled or mentally ill. Okay, so this starts off this bit of the story now by making us realize that there was no sort of exception to this. The Nazis were going to kill anybody that they deemed to be a nuisance or a possible diluter, if you like, of the Nazi state, including children. These four pictures you can clearly see are more physically disabled. Therefore, they will be dealt with in this T4 program that we'll talk about in a minute, just to make sure that they cannot pass on their genes. We see Down syndrome, physically disabled, scoliosis, it looks like, some learning difficulties perhaps, which is ironic when you look at the first picture. When we know that Joseph Goebbels had a club foot, so it seems to be, you know, what suited them. Perhaps the fact is that these people might grow up, these young children, to perpetuate their misfortune in others, is what they would say. So this little boy, Hans Frank, he's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed German boy, born in about 1925. So he's got all the characteristics. He's perfect in every way, but they even killed him at the age of 16. So have a little think why, and then obviously maybe pause the video before I tell you. You might be surprised, and then when you're ready, we'll carry on. So Hans Frank was killed because he had epilepsy, as were many children killed with epilepsy, because clearly this could be passed on. A lot of parents, mums, hid this from the state, which obviously you can imagine if the state finds out that a mum has hidden their child, then they would be in trouble as well when the Gestapo come knocking. A lot of people were caught by having a fit out in public. One case, a boy had a fit in a cinema, and of course the Gestapo found out very, very quickly. So there's lots of examples of these children who are killed for their epilepsy as well. Okay, so we can see again some physically disabled people here who are going to be removed from society, and this photograph is just really painful in lots of ways, because what we're looking at is young people with clearly some learning difficulties, but that girl just looks really happy. She's got no idea about what's happening and what's going to happen to her. And this is really the heartbreaking reality of this thing. When you take away all the sort of movies and the history of it, when you just look at this photograph and you just think of the innocence and the horror and evil that was put onto these really innocent young people just because the state decided these people were untermenschen and they might pass on their defective genes. This little girl who's happy, and the other kids in the photograph just look really happy. They've been sent to sort of what we might call today, I don't know, like a sort of different kind of education setting. So the parents have handed their children over to go to this different educational experience for, like, I don't know, special needs. And of course, when they're there, they more often than not were murdered in these places. So the parents would get a letter saying, oh, your child got a cold or flu or tuberculosis or whatever it might be at the time, and unfortunately they died, but they weren't, they were murdered. Okay, so this is a photograph that I want really to sort of draw into your empathy of this as much as possible, where we can't really empathize with this, can we? But we can certainly see it as a really human story and a human tragedy. And this is where those children would end up. They would go into these T4 programs, or these hospitals, where they would remove young people with lethal injection usually. But these photographs are just showing you how that works. Again, another photograph of people, young lads who are going to be murdered by the state because of their obvious learning difficulties or their Down syndrome. Again, another photograph of a baby clearly with some learning difficulties. These young children as well, even younger. All of these photographs are there for you to find. You could go down a rabbit hole if you started. This is the horror, this is the reality of the Nazi regime in their mission to create a master race, to create the Herrenvolk, and the 1,000-year Reich is to remove all of these undesirables from society. Photograph here again, similar to the other one, we can see lots of children with learning difficulties on the sort of top row to the left. Those two boys look really happy, and you can see these ladies in there, the carers. This often sort of, I don't know, affects me the most in this topic. When you see these ladies, these looking after these children who would be maybe involved, possibly involved in the killing of these children, who are posing for these photographs. They are trusted by these kids. They see them as adults looking out for them, and they may well be part of the T4 program in removing these children from society. This juxtaposition of evil along with innocence, again, it really does hit home the realities of this brutal regime, and this happens obviously in other dictatorships around the world too. We've seen with Pol Pot in Cambodia, they kill people who they believe to be undesirable or a danger or a threat. This Nazi Germany is no different. Okay, so Ernst Losse, 14 years old. We can see these two photographs here, one before and one after him being captured. And the photograph in the middle is him with his sisters. So Ernst Losse was murdered. He was given a lethal injection along with his family, his little brother and sisters, because they were gypsies. Okay, so this is an example again of children and a family, a whole family being wiped out because they were gypsies. And just putting some faces to some of the names, some of the stories, to hopefully in some tiny way give these people a little bit of their life back and their story to be told, to remind us of what happens when people go into evil mode. All right, another photograph of the workers of the T4 programs, the nurses doing the killings and the lethal injections, and the workers having a good old time after work, having a sing-song down the pub. That sort of, again, juxtaposition of doing that job and then socialising like it's a perfectly normal job, like working in Tesco's or something later on in the evening. That sort of, to me, I struggle to get my head around that's how they were able to do this and then go home to their own children and families and kiss their kids on the head and talk about their day and all those things, whilst their day job was to murder people. Just a really difficult thing to get your head around. Okay, so the facts that we'll need for the disabled and mentally ill, that they are a burden on society and they will weaken the racial purity. So that word burden is really important. And children in schools are going to be taught about the cost of their grandparents who are costing the state so much. And eventually they're going to be these angry little kids, as we've seen, and they'll go home and they'll start shouting at their parents because granddad's a burden on society and he should be killed and all of this stuff. Constant. So straight away in 1933, they passed the law for the prevention of hereditary diseased offspring. So basically to stop people having sex, or basically to sterilize people so they can't pass on the defective genes, if you like. So the compulsory sterilization, and by the end of the period, by 1939, just under 500,000 people had been sterilized, women had been sterilized. The mentally ill category could be anyone, so alcoholics, anyone with a physical deformation, epilepsy, deaf, blind, anxiety, depression, anything at all that could be deemed today as mentally ill, learning difficulties, autism, I don't know, ADHD, anything, the list goes on, you would be removed, essentially. That's the reality of the thing, because you might pass that on to your children. So any babies that were born with mental or physical disabilities, they were to be starved or given the lethal injection up to the age of 17. So the T4 program, which if you watch this in class, you'll have seen some videos about the T4 program. For those of you who are watching it on catch up because you missed the lesson, they'll be in the Google Classroom, the videos to watch. But if you're revising this for year 11, remember the T4 program was just a program where disabled young people went to these hospitals and were killed. That's the gist of it, really. Also remember that parents very often handed their children over to the state to be killed. Now that in itself, as we've talked about in class, is just mind-blowing, utterly mind-blowing that that's even a thing that parents, mums could do. That of course they believed if they didn't, then and they got found out, then they would be in trouble with the state for not doing their duty and dealing with this, or telling the state and getting it taken away. So about 5,000 children in total with disabilities were killed during this thing. This T4 program, just these few years building up to 1939. So if we just take a bit of a sort of breather, then a bit of a pause there, we've sort of done a journey of the minority groups, the 4 minority groups, and we're now ready to look into the persecution of the Jews specifically. All right, but that maths question in school, remember, that we did in the education lesson, where they worked out the cost of the grandparents and how many marriage loans they could pay for and things like that if they weren't paying for these disabled or old people. This is just an example to accentuate the program of the T4 program and to try and get people to support. And this source here is another typical propaganda source, but another maths lesson that you could perhaps think about. It talks about how the genetically ill person will cost Germany 60,000 marks over his lifetime. Then it says, citizens, this is your money. How can you be happy about this, that your money is going to these disabled people? So this is the kind of thing that was being forced out there, reinforcing that idea about the burden of these people. So you can make a little practice if you want with the inference for question 1 on this. Just pause the video, have a little practice of 2 inferences from this picture. We've just kind of talked about one of them really, but when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll move on. Okay, so the persecution of the Jews from 1933 to 1939 as well. This is obviously far more documented and we're far more aware of what happened to the Jewish people in this period. So we'll start in 1922. If I am ever in power, Hitler says, the destruction of the Jews will be my first and most important job. I shall have gallows after gallows erected in Munich. Then the Jews will be hanged one after the other. And they will stay hanging till they stink. Exactly the same procedure will be followed in other cities until Germany is cleansed of the last Jew. So this is Hitler speaking to a friend, Joseph Hell, in 1922. And if saying this in 1922, and then of course Mein Kampf in 1923, 24, there shouldn't have been any doubt that this was the policies of the Nazis. And I think this is one of those times where it's a good example to think about. When somebody shows you who they are, believe them for the first time. So there are about 437,000 Jews in Germany at the time. There's only 1% of the population, but they're going to be removed completely, almost completely by the end of the Holocaust. All German Jews pretty much had been removed. So this is our starting point, and this is going to grow and grow and grow into what ends up being the final solution and the Holocaust. So in your book or your notes on this, can you just do this little timeline? It's really important, okay? We've obviously started the propaganda movies, the Eternal Jew, portraying the Jews as vermin and filth and flies. And then in March 1933, straight into power, after the fire, things like that. Just around that election time of 1933, they had the boycott of Jewish shops and businesses, one of the first acts, if you like, that Hitler did as Chancellor. Then April, he banned Jews from government jobs. Civil servants and teachers were all sacked straight away. We're not wasting any time at all there. Perhaps this is where you start thinking to yourself, this is not a surprise. This was inevitable. Then as the year goes on, September 1933, they passed a law banning Jews from inheriting land. The state are going to take that land instead. And of course, the Jews in Germany were possibly wealthy as well. So they will have had some land that will now come into possession of the state. So that's very quickly happening. In 1934, as we get towards the Enabling Act and total power, the Jews are banned from parks and swimming pools, yellow park benches provided to keep, quote, normal Germans safe. So we're seeing some similar things perhaps to America in the same period, the Jim Crow laws and some of that stuff from the civil rights movement as we get into the 50s. So this is very similar to there, isn't it? This persecution of black people in the deep south. So we're not even really the Führer yet, and we can see some of the events that have been passed. Now, we talk again about how these things were allowed to be passed without some sort of opposition. But don't forget, very quickly, the terror program was set up, the Gestapo and the SD and all of that very quickly as well. The problem is this was all during the time before Hitler becomes the Führer, where he takes complete control. So if this is happening before then you can only imagine. And of course, we know what happens after the Hitler becomes the Führer. So by 1935, this is the time where Hitler is in total power. He is the Führer. Jews are being banned from the army because you can't possibly fight and have a Jew in the ranks when you're putting all this propaganda out there about how our Jews are vermin and they're subhuman. It just wouldn't go down well with Germans in a war fighting next to these people who they're told they're supposed to hate. So they're banned from the army. And we can see the stars there. One of the famous things, you should learn that in primary school, I think, don't you, where they had to wear the star on their clothes. And these two little babies are being forced to wear the star. Now, a lot of people often ask me, why don't you just not wear the star or pretend to not be Jewish? Remember, about 5 years before this, where we are now, looking at the screen, these people were friends with Jews. They went to school with the Jews. So everybody knows who the Jews were. You can't just all of a sudden not be. That's the problem with this. Everybody knows everyone in the villages and stuff. So when the law changes, you still know these people. You still used to be their friends. So it wasn't really possible to hide the fact that you were a Jew because you didn't hide it before because you didn't have to. Okay, so there's some of the main things, and we're going to look at the Nuremberg laws in a sec, really specifically some laws about being a citizen. So on the 15th of September 1935, now that he's Führer, he passes these laws, the Nuremberg laws they're called. So only those of German blood could be German citizens. Jews lost their citizenship and became aliens, essentially, so they can't have any rights at all. Even if they are German, they lose all of their citizenship, all of the rights that come with being a citizen, hospitals, education, things like that. Jews could not marry German citizens, we know that, and Germans who find themselves in a relationship with a Jew, that's the death penalty now, isn't it? So we can see how that might split families up, perhaps if there were Germans who'd been married to Jews previously, all sorts of complications there. But generally speaking, you can't be married to a Jew. Jews cannot have sex with German citizens. If they're caught, they will be punished. Death penalty, just as if vice versa. So we can see that things have just got more serious now. Now, apart from having to sit on a bench or not allowed to go swimming or whatever, you're now affecting the Jewish people's lives really seriously. March 1938, Jews now have to register all of their possessions and carry identity cards. So again, we're now infringing on their rights and their liberties and their freedoms. Not that they have any anymore after the Nuremberg laws because they've lost all their citizenship, but it makes it easy to then persecute and find and hunt them down and of course know what they have so you can take it. And then the most serious of all of the things that happened to the Jews in this period is Kristallnacht. We'll talk about that in a sec, but this is the night it became acceptable to physically hurt the Jews, physically kill them, but physically hurt them. Everything so far has been laws or propaganda or sort of persecution, not being able to go into the shops and all those kind of things, really bad stuff. Things like phones not allowed, all sorts of things. But then Kristallnacht in 1938, November, that's when it got a bit more serious. Well, very much more serious. Sorry, let me just clarify. Not a bit more, incredibly serious for the Jews. This is where there was a clear turning point. All right. Then in 1939, they have to wear this star in occupied Poland, so Germans could easily recognize them once they've gone into Poland to start the war. Okay, so the shop boycotts, we can see the photographs here. They are very clear, very visual. Anyone seen going into these shops, but of course this is going to ruin their livelihoods. They're going to lose all their money and go bust, I guess. And then the state will just step in and take them. We can see this photograph here. It's quite an old source, but the photograph is taken in July 1933, so really quickly. Nazi stormtroopers arrested a woman and her Jewish partner. The sign around the neck says, "I am the biggest pig of all. I only sleep with Jews." The man's sign says, "I am a Jewish boy who always brings German girls to my room." So they're being physically paraded around the streets, put into the newspapers. You can see some of the stormtroopers there are young, very young, maybe early 20s, late teens maybe, who are going around rounding up these other kids as well. So you can see the reality of this thing. We know about the terror story. There was just no way away from it. So now the Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass is what that means in English. So with the bullet points that are about to come up on the screen, just make this a little flowchart or tell a story or a storyboard of it to try and help you get the story in your head. Storyboards, obviously, for history revision are always really, really good because you get to think about the story, its next step and what it leads to. So firstly, the whole thing started by a Polish Jew in Paris who shot a German. Okay, this led to Goebbels ordering local newspapers in the shooter's hometown to condemn him. I think we've seen similar things around the world recently where the government have taken an event and they've made it huge. Maybe started creating a bit of a witch hunt and things like that for a certain person or groups of people. The SA, the SS and the Gestapo begin on this night attacking synagogues and houses, breaking into people's houses, arresting people and removing them, killing them, beating them up, taking them to camps. A really concerted effort, but the police were told not to stop it. So this is the bit where it's sort of really important. The violence goes from Hanover, which is where this Polish Jew was living, to the nationwide. Imagine social media today, how quickly this event would get out of hand today. We have seen it. We see it all around the world, don't we? In certain parts of the world, we can see how these violent acts or protests or whatever very quickly get a lot of support. So the violence spreads nationwide in Germany and Austria. as people just have essentially been given permission to go and attack Jews. They obviously want to, they're learning to in school. Now they've been given permission to do it, a little bit like The Purge, the movie, to sort of minimize in that sense, just to give you an idea that it was almost acceptable. And it's acceptable because the police were told to do nothing. They were told not to prevent any violence against the Jews. Anyone could be arrested, as many as possible, as many they could get into the prisons as possible. That is to be what is going to happen on this night. So Jewish property was smashed up and burned by the Hitler Youth and the SA. You could almost imagine they were having the time of their lives. Specific examples, there are loads. A Jewish teenager was thrown from a third-floor window by the Hitler Youth. Some Germans were horrified, some joined in. And in this one night of horror, 100 Jews were killed. Now, when we look at the millions in the Holocaust, maybe 100 sort of pales in insignificance, but this is before that. This is 100 Jewish people killed violently. If that happened today in our country, it was on the news tomorrow night, that 100 English people have been murdered, we'd be in shock. We'd be very upset, be very angry, or most of us certainly would be. So some Germans were horrified by this, but a lot of Germans joined in, and we can see the outcome of that. And then after the mess, Jews were fined £1 billion to pay for all the damage. So just adding insult to injury, really, there, adding salt to the wound. The Jews that had survived this thing were then forced to pay to repair all the broken windows. We know that children were forced to walk out in a children's hospital, for example. They were forced to walk over the broken glass in barefoot. This was just utter horror that was now being played out. And once people realized on the 10th and 11th of November that nothing was going to happen, then you can see why it very quickly was a turning point, and the persecution to Jews and other minorities got really violent really quickly, because everybody sort of knew that no one was going to stop them. Okay, so that's the gist of the Kristallnacht story, as an example that you'd give in your paragraph on the Jewish persecutions. 20,000 Jews have been rounded up by the 12th, so a huge amount sent to camps, and their jobs, remember from the economy lesson, has been given to the Germans now, but 20,000 people sent to camps. Not death camps just yet, but sent to camps as political prisoners, and if they die in these places, then that's no loss to the state. Okay, so quite a brutal lesson, as we know, and we warned at the start of it. The content is really, really, really serious. So let's step back a little bit from that and think about this in an exam kind of thing. So if this was section B, we want to have a look at these interpretations. So what is the view of each interpretation about persecutions towards the Jews? In this case, both of these interpretations are about Kristallnacht. So pause the video, do your interpretations. Remember that they might not always be positive, negative. They might be one thing or other. So see if you can work it out. Unpause the video, and then when you're ready, come back and we'll carry on. Okay, so interpretation 1 for me sort of suggests that it was a normal event, that these people persecuted the Jews a lot. This time it was much more serious, clearly more widespread and more destructive. It demonstrated the hatred of the Jews now gripped not only the stormtroopers, but was spreading to other parts of the population as well. Above all, to the young, upon whom 5 years of Nazism in schools had clearly had an effect. Interpretation 2 says this led to Kristallnacht, so called because of the thousands of Jewish shop windows which were smashed. Many Germans watched the events with alarm and concern. However, the Nazi-controlled press presented it as a reaction of ordinary Germans against Jews. Most Germans did not believe this, but hardly anyone protested. So there's a couple of ways you can go on this. These are not easy by any stretch to see a difference. Interpretation 1 essentially is saying that young people were joining in, but it was the stormtroopers, the government, who were doing this hatred. And then the interpretation 2 might suggest, you may say the difference being that this started being normal Germans who got involved. Or you can say that some people were against it, and it seemed to be in interpretation 2 by it saying some Germans did not believe this. And the first one, everyone was in support of it, I guess you could work out. So these are quite difficult, these interpretations, but there is something in there that you can work out as fairly supportive or not supportive of the thing, or the who is doing the acts, who is doing the violence. One suggesting the government and the SA and the SS, and the other that normal people started getting involved. So hopefully you got something along those lines. And then we think about this as the 20 marker. Do you agree? Do you agree with interpretation 2 that this was I suppose, done by the masses, the normal people, and so on like that. So you'll need your own knowledge, but that's where this lesson's content will come in. 2 quotes, remember, from each interpretation, backed up with some own knowledge for each quote. No need for provenance in this. It's not the source question. So if you want, have a go at this and then hand it in to your teacher to be marked. It's probably one of the more difficult 20 markers, but the section B would generally be on persecutions generally. These 2 examples, it's unlikely that the whole of section B will be focusing on just Kristallnacht, but it could do though, although it's hard to sort of do that on one event when it's not really clear who was involved and who supported, because it was just an absolute violent mess. But it is possible. You can clearly see that our exam board have given us 2 interpretations about Kristallnacht, which means it's very possible. So try and get your head around what these 2 things are saying and whether or not you agree with them, and bring in some of that own knowledge that we've talked about. The bullet points, the flowchart of the Kristallnacht event. And of course, if you're watching this on catch up, the videos on the Google Classroom, and if you're not revising and you remember doing it in class, we watched those videos of Kristallnacht where they took people to bridges, shot them, and things like that. So we've got this really clear message and knowledge for this topic that we can easily see that it was the SS, the SA, the Hitler Youth, but we also have enough evidence to say that it was other people as well. Okay, so why was there so little opposition by 1939? It was decided to evict all the Jews in January of 39, so they're all going to go to Eastern Europe, to the ghettos. And as we know from that story, the ghettos then moved on to the camps. So the Nazi government kept some of these atrocities secret. That's one reason why. Most of what was happening was well known both within Germany and abroad, though. Again, we talk about this sort of Neville Chamberlain thing, this appeasement of the Nazis, allowing these things to happen and never really stepping in. Although arguably they might say we can't interfere in other countries, it's not our place. Many Germans took part in the persecutions. That's why there was so little opposition. Many Germans believed it. Many Germans were just waiting for the excuse or the being allowed to do it. So that's why there was little opposition. And then no one did anything to stop it abroad, as we've just mentioned, or within Germany. And that is because obviously they were petrified. The terror thing, if you were seen trying to help a Jew or help one of these minorities, then you too would find yourself in trouble. And basically, anyone who does criticise them, as you know, are dealt with severely. They may be killed, or they certainly would be sent to a camp. So that's why no one opposed this kind of terror and persecution. This is all common sense, this bit here. It's really clear as to why that happened. All right. So others convinced themselves that the suffering inflicted on the Jews was not real. Like it wasn't really happening. Almost, can you believe? No, there's no way that could be happening in our country. Those kind of things, people tried to convince themselves it wasn't happening. Just probably like what's happening in America right now with some of the horrendous things that we see with the camps and stuff. A lot of Americans are sort of maybe just trying to get their head around the fact that, nah, it's just propaganda. You can't believe everything you see. It's not all those kind of things. So there's definitely an element of society that couldn't believe these things were actually happening. All right, and then finally, many Germans seem to have become convinced by the ideas that at the time this was justified. This was the right thing to do. The propaganda had convinced them that these people were a danger to our great Germany, making Germany great again. And these people, they just have to go. It's a small part of a bigger problem. They were convinced by it. So that led to them supporting it and maybe even being involved in it because they fell for the propaganda, or they just genuinely believed it and had these anti-Semitic views or these racist views or homophobic views. Anyway, this party, the Nazi party, allowed them to do and be whatever they wanted to be. All right. So just let's finish this lesson by having a quick look at the Holocaust. Now, remember that our course stops in 1939. So this really is just a little reminder. We did this in Key Stage 3. Every single student in the country does the Holocaust by law. So just to remind ourselves of this final solution in 1942, we start with Kristallnacht and then we end up a couple of years later in the final solution, which was the extermination of Jews in the death camps, where 6 million Jews were killed, about 1.2 million in Auschwitz, the most famous of the death camps. So we're going to look at some images and have a little think about the Holocaust, how it went from a yellow park bench, not being allowed to go swimming, to the murder of 6 million people and the other minorities who were killed as well. Okay, so this is post 1939. This is in Eastern Europe by the Einsatzgruppen. A lot of the women have been taken to the countryside. They've been stripped naked. All of that to obviously add to the horrors of the thing, the vulnerability, with their babies. And they've been told that they're obviously going to be killed now. They've possibly in some ways dug their own graves in these fields, and they're going to be killed and put in them. And this is a photograph after that. You can see these people going around just shooting individuals who are not dead yet. So these photographs, they don't need any more said. You can see, you've got eyes. This is what hate leads to. This is what governments who encourage this kind of thing lead to. People doing things that maybe 20 years earlier would never have dreamed that they would ever find themselves doing, or wanting to do, or believing this was the right thing to do. This is the danger of the current world. So then we can see these images here again to remind you the pits of bodies. You can just about see in the top right hand side the man is getting shot in the head, is about to be falling into that pit. We can see children in the ghettos, a lot of them without adults. The adults have probably died and they're just left in the street, and you can see all the children behind the barbed wire in the top one. This is all the reality. This is what comes when we allow terror and hate to spread. These are sources, obviously they're drawings, and the reality is possibly no one would really know what happened inside those gas chambers because nobody ever came out. But we can sort of imagine that's what it would have been like. You can see the first one, source B, as women and children, with the camp commander pushing them into the gas chambers. The picture below that, you can see bodies being put into the ovens, and then obviously the anguish of the picture. There's a woman holding onto a baby, people looking up, gasping for breath. A sort of interpretation of what it would have been like inside the gas chambers. Just utterly horrendous, heartbreaking images, and we can probably work out that that's quite true. And the little boy at the front of source B just holding on to his mum without any idea. All of it just heartbroken, the horror and the pain inside of those gas chambers. All right, so let's end this lesson here now. This little bit at the end was just to remind us where it ended, but I want us to start with this. Just let's remember as a human that we're remembering these horrors, and hopefully we can stop as a society these things continuing to happen. I don't know. This is not a judgment on anybody's politics or any of those kind of things. I'm pretty sure the vast majority of us are saddened by this lesson and the thought that it can happen. They said, please remember us. That was the last words these two children said as they left the gas chambers, I suppose implying they know what's coming. And I just want to end really by saying, remember, this did not start in Auschwitz. It didn't start in the gas chambers or the ovens. It started with words much earlier on. Okay, so we often people say the problem with history is we don't learn from history. Let's hope that we learn from history, and that what's happening in the world are all over the world now in various countries. People can just look back and see how this might end, and maybe we can do something about it. Anyway, as always, thank you very much for listening. Hopefully this gives you the information that you need about the persecutions of the minorities and the Jews. If you need anything, remember to just ask your teacher. Or if you have any work, you want to hand in your 20 marker, please do. Remember, all of our lessons are on our website as well, stchistory.com. And we'll see you for the next video. Thank you very much, and goodbye.